Great. Take it away, Pastor Dan or Pastor Keith and Dan.
And Mr. Dan. Um, I am Pastor Keith Fry, and I serve you as the executive for Office of the Secretary Administration in the churchwide offices in Chicago. And I'm joined this evening by my colleague, Dan Epley, who serves as our manager for official documentation for the churchwide organization. Uh, just a very brief overview of where we're going to head this evening. First off, we're going to review or present for some of you the first time the underlying concepts behind the constitutions of the ELCA and sort of the way that they're organized and the way that they work. We're going to look at the process of amending and updating your congregation constitution. And then we'll look specifically, as Bishop Briner mentioned, we'll look specifically at the updates that came out of the 2025 Churchwide Assembly, which took place just in August, at the beginning of August. And then at the end, we'll open it up for any questions that you may have. And if there is anything along the way, just put something in the chat or jot down your questions and we'll make sure to address those.
All right. And there we go. There we go. Having trouble getting my slides to advance. Sorry about that. So we're going to be focusing, of course, on the constitutions of congregations because that's where your interests lie. But it is worth noting that just as this church has three expressions, there are also three different types of constitutions in this church. There is the first on here, the Constitution, bylaws, and continuing resolutions of the ELCA. Those govern the entire ELCA as a body, particularly focusing on churchwide expressions such as the churchwide organization and especially the churchwide assembly. But each of the other expressions of this church, synods, each synod will have a constitution that governs its organization and how it functions. And there is, approved by the churchwide assembly, a constitution for synods that provides a foundation and some guidance to synods in how they should form their constitutions. And similarly, just as the churchwide assembly gives guidance to synods, the churchwide assembly also provides guidance to congregations in forming their constitutions. And that is what you're going to find in the model constitution for congregations.
So why do we call it a model constitution? Well, because it is not entirely prescriptive. It serves as a model. There are pieces that, as you will see in a few moments, that are expected of all congregations in the ELCA, but there are also pieces that are customized to local context. Former presiding Bishop Eaton had a set of statements that she was well known for. We are church, we are Lutheran, we are church together, and we are church for the sake of the world. And presiding Bishop Curry announced this past week that his focus is going to be on connection and what connects us together as a church. Having shared commitments is one of the ways that we are bound together as a denomination, as a church. However, at the same time, from the very beginning of the Lutheran movement of reform in the church, we've had an understanding as Lutherans that it is neither necessary nor even desirable that our practices be totally identical in every worshiping community, because context matters for the gospel. What serves the gospel in one place may not serve the gospel in another. So the model constitution recognizes that reality, and it provides for cohesiveness without requiring absolute uniformity. So we have a commitment to seeing ourselves with others as part of this one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and the constitutions help define that and what our shared commitments are. But also then the Constitution recognizes that your local congregation and the context in which you serve the gospel will be very different from other congregations. And so there's this mix of shared commitment and of flexibility. Among those shared commitments are the lists that you see here. And these are actually the chapter titles as you go through the model constitution. So the things that are shared by all ELCA congregations are our confession of faith, the statement on the nature of the church, and the statement of purpose of the church, the list of powers of the congregation, the rules about affiliation with the church and with your synod, the rules on property ownership, membership, so that the categories of membership are uniform across this church, the qualifications and the expectations of rostered ministers, the process for discipline of members and of adjudication of disputes, the process for amending your constitution, indemnification, and then there's a chapter also that's shared with all on how to form a parish with other congregations. Now, in the model constitution, those provisions that you just saw are all marked with an asterisk, which shows that they are the commitments that are required of all congregations. And they help set expectations about what we believe together, what authority and responsibilities the congregation has, what the expectations are of our ministers, and the relationship between the minister and the congregation. And they also help establish fairness for members and ministers alike, and also help you ensure that important legal considerations are addressed. But at the same time, as I said, we want to help establish connection and equitable treatment, but we recognize that there are many different procedures that may be possible, and that there are many different ways of organizing ministry within a congregation. And there are many ways that a congregation can choose to govern itself. And so there are sections, large sections of the model constitution that are not marked with an asterisk and that are recommended because of experience that says these things really can work, but that are not required because you, as members of a congregation or leaders of a congregation, know best what is going to work given the history and the context of your congregation. So all of the details about congregation meetings, the officers of your congregation, how your congregation council is constituted, who has voice and vote on that, what the committees are in your congregation, and other organizations within your congregation, those are all left open-ended for you to tailor to your context and how you're serving the gospel in your place.
Excuse me. Sorry for advancing the slide a bit early there. Next
That's
time
okay.
I'll wait for you to give me a nod next time. But as Keith was alluding to there, and just to sort of make explicit some of the things he was pointing at, there are in the constitution of each congregation, you're going to typically find 3 different types of provisions. As Keith mentioned, there are required provisions, and these are the parts of the model constitution that was referenced earlier. The model constitution approved by the churchwide assembly and designated by an asterisk, as was mentioned. And these provisions approved by the churchwide assembly It is required that congregations in the ELCA, anytime they amend their constitution, they are required to amend it so that the required provisions from the model constitution are included within the constitution of the congregation. And they must be included as written, without alteration, as it is said, without addition, omission, or alteration, as is sometimes said. Those are, again, those ones that reflect the shared commitments of this church, as well as things that are deemed to be essential for functioning as an ELCA congregation. There are, in addition to that, again, as Keith was talking about, when we talk about the flexibility for local context, while there is flexibility with regard to those elements Keith just talked about, the Churchwide Assembly also thought it's wise to provide some guidance, some suggestions to share the wisdom of the collective church, especially over the history of this church and the predecessor bodies, things that have been learned. And so even where there is freedom, the Model Constitution provides what are called recommended provisions. These are all the provisions in the Model Constitution that do not have an asterisk. Again, those are suggested, those are deemed wise by the Churchwide Assembly, but each congregation is free to use or not use them as they see fit. Again, you know your context, and what is wise for 90% of the church may not be wise for your context. And so each congregation has the freedom. Each congregation is strongly recommended to consider these provisions and to assess them and consider adopting them. But if a congregation chooses not to, that's entirely their prerogative. And then congregation constitutions have a third type of provision, and these are local things that are not included in the model constitution at all. These will be local rules, local standards that are set by the congregation. Oftentimes, these local provisions are sort of based on recommended provisions, maybe altered a bit or tweaked a bit to fit the context. But there are also provisions that do not show up anywhere in the model constitution. Again, to define specific aspects of your congregation that are not, again, that are local to your specific context. So you're going to find those three types of provisions in your constitution, your congregation's constitution, almost certainly. You will almost certainly also in your congregation constitution find more than just the provisions. While the model constitution itself only includes provisions, they are not the only thing that are in most church or most congregation constitutions. There are, of course, these constitutional provisions, both required and some recommended, and then local provisions. And these are the broadest, most basic, fundamental aspects of what it means to be your congregation, sort of the defining elements of who we are as a congregation. Again, these are broadest, most foundational, most basic, and they're the most difficult to adopt or to change. Because again, you don't want your foundational values to be changed easily or on a whim. Somewhat sort of below that, if you will, in specificity and in importance, in a certain sense, are the bylaws. These tend to be more detailed. They will often relate to or flesh out provisions. For example, as we'll see, a foundational provision might be that this congregation must hold at least one annual congregational meeting. At least once a year, you must meet as a congregation meeting. And then the time of that meeting, the day and time of that meeting might be specified in a bylaw, a little bit more specific. Again, these are somewhat easier to adopt and amend, and more specific, if you will. And then finally, at the most specific, most sort of granular level, as far as defining the more day-to-day-ish workings of the congregation, are going to be continuing resolutions. These are the most specific and the most likely to change because circumstances and situations change, because they're most closely bound to the particular situation of the congregation. And so they are therefore the easiest to adopt and to amend. And we'll see the processes for adopting and amending each of these in a little bit. One other thing that's worth discussing is the recommended organization of a congregation constitution. And here is an example showing what is recommended for the organization of a constitution, the organization of the provisions, the bylaws, and the continuing resolutions. There are some places where you will find provisions, bylaws, and continuing resolutions in separate documents. That is not recommended, partially or primarily simply for convenience, so that you don't have to have 3 documents in front of you to know what your congregation says about a particular topic. And so the recommended organization and designation of bylaws and provisions and continuing resolutions is as shown here. So, for example, here is a provision from the Model Constitution specifying what I just mentioned about the congregation meeting being at least once a year. And so that's a provision that is in the Model Constitution. As you see, there's no asterisk. It is not required, but many congregations have a similar provision to this, if not this exactly. Then you would include the bylaws that give more detail on the congregation meeting the annual congregation meeting would be included directly below. And as you see, a provision has the chapter number followed by a provision number. Bylaws have the chapter number followed by the provision number to which it relates, and then a number designating the bylaw, distinguishing it from other bylaws. So, for example, a bylaw might specify the time and place at which meetings are held, which, in fact, the provision says needs to be done. You can have other bylaws relating to the same provision, and those will be sequentially underneath it. Bylaws can be organized in whatever way seems logical to the congregation, what you specify first, second, or third. You can have 2, 3, 4, any number of bylaws associated with a provision. For example, in the ELCA Constitution, there are some provisions that have 10 or 12 bylaws associated with them. Most certainly do not, but it certainly can be done when a lot of specificity is needed. For example, a bylaw might specify where meetings are typically held. You might want to specify that they are held in the church building so that meetings aren't being, held other places, if that is a concern. And then you can have other, on the more specific level, beneath all of the bylaws, if there are any continuing resolutions, they can be included again all together and below or after all of the bylaws. And these are designated again with the chapter number, followed by the provision number to which they relate, and then designated by a letter and a number. The letter designates the order, so this is the first continuing resolution, thus A, and the number designates the year in which it was adopted. So, for example, if this bylaw were adopted, if this continuing resolution were adopted in 2022, it would be A22. And again, as an example, a congregation might choose to specify that if the congregation council is, if the annual meeting is going to discuss budgetary matters, then the treasurer must be present. Again, whether that's a good continuing resolution, I don't know, but you could, if you wanted to, make that a continuing resolution. Similarly, the second continuing resolution, again, just an example. If there is another one, it will be B and come after A, naturally. This one was adopted in 2007, thus the 07. As you see here, continuing resolutions do not need to be in chronological order. They can be in any order the congregation thinks makes sense for organizing them. Just a few more examples of organization. Another provision relating to who can call a special meeting of the congregation, and you might want to have 2 bylaws with that. If so, they would come exactly after it, 01 and 02. And then you might have a a continuing resolution, this one adopted in 2019, after that. Other provisions, provision 3, provision 4, 5. Again, as you see here, it is often the case that provisions do not have any bylaws with them or continuing resolutions. Many don't need more specificity. Sometimes a provision, for example, 10.6, might have only a bylaw specifying something, and or it might have only a continuing resolution. For example, Robert's Rules of Order is the latest edition, is going to govern the meetings. For example, a congregation that is Spanish speaking might want to designate a specific translation of Robert's Rules as their standard. That would probably be something you'd want to keep continuing resolution level in case a better translation comes along. Again, you might or might not have that. And as you see, many provisions have no continuing resolutions or bylaws. Some have only bylaws. Some have only continuing resolutions, and some have both. So that's the recommended organization, again, to keep all of the information about a particular topic together to make it easy to find and know what your congregation says about the topic at hand.
And before we jump from that, one of the common questions we get is, do we have to have our bylaws incorporated into the body of the Constitution? The short answer is no, but it certainly is recommended for the primary reason that if one of the constitutional provisions changes, it's much, much easier for you to have the bylaws and the related continuing resolutions directly underneath that in your Constitution, so you can see if those are affected by any changes that happen. So we recommend it, but you don't have to go back and incorporate them all if you don't want to. Now, is your congregation's constitution up to date? We are not going to do any constitution shaming here today, because having been in the parish myself and knowing that congregations can get a little bit behind on these details, we're not going to ask you how far out of date your Constitution may be, nor will we ask you how up to date it may be. But we will encourage you to remember that the Churchwide Assembly meets every 3 years. And typically, without fail, the Churchwide Assembly is going to make some amendments to the model Constitution. This assembly, there were relatively few changes. So this is a really great year to get into the cycle of reviewing your Constitution. But we recommend that you do this not only just so that the details are all accurate, but it's also a good opportunity for you to, at least every 3 years, look at what your agreements with one another in the congregation are and review and make sure that they still reflect your congregation's realities. I'll give an example. In one of my congregations, they had a bylaw that required a youth committee. Unfortunately, there were no youth in the congregation. Consequently, they were perpetually in violation of the Constitution because they didn't appoint a youth committee any longer. So this review can also help you spot things that no longer work in your congregation that may have been true 20 years ago, but that aren't now true for the context in which you find yourself. So it's a really good idea to do this review, have somebody appointed by your congregation council to do the review, and to bring it to the council and make it a topic of discussion. Here are some things that we may want to consider. Do we need some change on this? But then also to help keep you up with the things that our shared commitments as the wider church would call for. And by doing that review right after the assembly meets, you also make sure that you have time to give notice to your congregation to make that you are hoping to make amendments at the congregation meeting. So it's a good trigger for that process every 3 years. Dan?
And to find the documentation you need for this, the churchwide organization, among Keith and Mai's job, is to make sure the documents you need to keep your constitution up to date are available to you. And where you can find those, where you want to go to find those, is to the address here. This is a link. So we will post this PowerPoint along with the video, and this will take you right to the link. It is going to the Office of the Secretary within the ELCA, and then to constitutions within that. Or, as Keith helpfully mentioned in the slide, you can just go to elca.org. There is a search engine at the upper right-hand corner. Type in constitutions, and it will take you where you want to go. So what you're going to find when you go to this website is several things that will be helpful for updating your constitution. First, you will find the most recent or up-to-date edition of the Model Constitution for Congregations. As you see here, it is available both in Spanish and in English, and this is available as a Word document. So with those required provisions, you can simply cut and paste them. So that is hopefully making it more convenient for you. You will also find you will also find below that a document that was presented to the voting members at the churchwide assembly, or is an excerpt from what was provided to the voting members at the churchwide assembly, that list the amendments that were approved by the churchwide assembly, and then also provides rationales explaining why the churchwide organization or whoever is bringing these proposals forward thinks they're a good idea. Why would the churchwide assembly be wise to adopt these things? Or why, now that the churchwide assembly has happened, why did the churchwide assembly, one reason why they might have adopted these things? So you will find that again also in English and in Spanish. And that is helpful, of course, for pointing you where in the model constitution you want to look for what has changed. But suppose somehow you've gotten behind in updating your constitution. We're also ready to help you with that. You'll see in the bottom, in the lower left-hand corner, lower right-hand corner of the screen, which is in about the middle of the web page when you go there, you see this yellow rectangle, which provides you an archive of amendments. And Keith, what are they going to find there?
Well, what they may find is that it's been a very long time since they last amended, and that there may be so many amendments that it's not possible to, or it's not simple to just put them, take the ones since the last churchwide assembly that you updated for. So basically, if let's say it's been a couple of churchwide assemblies or a few churchwide assemblies since you last amended, in that case, it really is simplest to just take the amendments documents for each of the years since the last time you updated and put those side by side with your constitution, and then make a document that shows what you would like to change. And again, if it's an asterisk thing, then you need to change it. If it is not asterisk, then it's up to the discernment of the leadership of the congregation as to what will be put before the congregation as recommendations for change. But let's say it has been 15 years. At that point, really the simplest thing is to take the Word file of your congregation's constitution and the Word file of the 2025 Model Constitution for Congregations, put those side by side, and in Word, Microsoft Word, there is a feature called Document Compare. And you can compare the two documents and it will highlight everything for you that is different. And that may be, if you've gone a long time, it may be the most efficient way for you to do it rather than to look at all the specific amendments, which may have piled up. So we also this year, for those of you who have been amending over the years, we used to put the documents in a weird little format that we used for printing the Constitution. We now have converted all of our constitutions to 8.5 by 11. And so it should be much, much simpler for you to cut and paste and to bring in the formatting or to reformat to make it match your document. So we listen to you on that. And again, if you amend, you need to amend all asterisk provisions, and then you can pick and choose among the recommended provisions or add in any new provisions or bylaws or continuing resolutions that your congregation is considering. One other thing that we would really recommend as you go into the process of determining which amendments you are going to propose to your congregation, we really truly recommend that you contact your synod and find out. Most synods have either a constitution committee or an individual or a group of individuals who are designated to review constitutions. It's a really good idea to send them to those folks and let them review it before you go through the process of having your congregation vote on something that might somehow be running afoul of the constitutions of the ELCA. So the synod can really advise you on language. They can also help you know which things may be contradictory. They can point out a number of helpful things. And that way you don't get to your congregation meeting, have them vote on an amendment, and then when it goes to be approved, the Senate says, ouch, wait. So it's good to collaborate early in the process. Now, let's talk about the actual process of amendment. The Model Constitution spells out, there's a slightly different process for each of the three types of material in the Constitution. Chapter 16 spells out how to amend provisions, whether they are required provisions or alterations of suggested provisions or local provisions. Chapter 17 explains the process for amending bylaws, and Chapter 18 explains the process for continuing resolutions. So when you are dealing with provisions, remember those are those most fundamental parts of the Constitution, the basic parameters being laid out for the congregation. If you are looking at required provisions, those with asterisks, they must be used exactly as they appear in the Model Constitution for congregations. Now, sometimes you'll see a blank or you'll see some brackets and with some choices that you can make. That is an acceptable variation as long as you stay within that. But required asterisk provisions need to be brought into your Constitution as they are worded in the model. All they require is that they be noticed to your voting members at least 30 days prior to the congregation meeting at which they'll be voted on. And all those require is a majority vote of any legally called congregation meeting. It can be a special meeting or your regular meeting. And those provisions go into effect immediately. You don't need Senate approval on those. All you need to do is notify the Senate that those have now been adopted and placed into your Constitution. All other provisions, those bold-faced fundamental things, including ones where you've taken recommended provisions and made changes to them. And actually, I should have said in the first section, if there are recommended provisions and you use them exactly as they're worded in the model, then all they require is a majority vote as well, because the language has already been approved by the Churchwide Assembly. So then if you let's say you take a recommended provision and you don't like the whole thing or it doesn't fit your needs, and so you make changes to a recommended provision, or you are writing your own provision or amending a purely local provision of your Constitution that already exists, those require a two-step process. So they have to be proposed to your congregation council at least 60 days prior to a vote, and notice has to go to the members of the congregation at least 30 days prior to a vote. And in your Constitution, it will specify if that amendment is not coming from the council, but is coming from voting members of the congregation, your own Constitution will tell you how many voting members are required in order to ask the council to put that onto the agenda. So if the voting members, the right number of voting members according to your Constitution, come to the council and say, we want this put on the agenda as an amendment, if you have the required number of voting members, then the council has to pass that along to the congregation with the council's recommendation as to whether or not they recommend its passage. Then those require a majority vote at any initial, at a first congregation meeting. And again, it can be special meeting or it can be a regular annual meeting. And then if it passes with a majority vote, that first vote, then at the next regularly scheduled congregation meeting, it needs to be ratified by a 2/3 vote of the congregation, and it cannot be amended any further. So you can't come back to the second meeting and say, oh, I would like us to switch out this word. No, it has to be ratified exactly as it was voted on at that first vote. And if then 2/3 vote to ratify, then that is sent to the Senate for final approval, and the new provisions go into effect once they are approved by the Senate.
As we mentioned, provisions are more difficult to amend, and you see it's a fairly involved process to amend, especially if it's not something that's already in the model constitution, either required or recommended. Bylaws, again, that next level of specificity, that next level of difficulty changing. All bylaws are local bylaws. There are no bylaws in the model constitution. Sometimes, as you saw, perhaps, as you may have noticed a little bit ago, sometimes the model constitution will specify that something will be detailed in a bylaw, but it won't say what that bylaw should be. So all bylaws are local. Bylaws may not contradict the constitutional provisions. They can't contradict something of a higher authority, a provision. In order to amend or add a bylaw, you must make a proposal to the congregation council at least 60 days before a vote. And then it must be proposed to voting members of the congregation at least 30 days before a vote. And once again, as Keith said, a number of voting members can bring it forward without congregation council approval should they desire to. But the congregation council will then have the right to say whether they recommend or not that it be passed. So must be shared with the council at least 60 days in advance, with voting members at least 30 days before a vote. 2/3 vote is required at any legally called congregation meeting. And once that 2/3 vote at a congregation meeting is achieved, the new bylaw is in effect. There is no approval needed by the synod. But you are required to notify the synod, to tell them that you have adopted this bylaw. And again, the synod does not need to ratify it, does not need to approve it for it to go into effect. But it is important to notify the synod because sometimes bylaws are passed that inadvertently contradict a provision somewhere else in the Constitution that you weren't thinking of at the time. And your synod, when they review it, one of the things they'll be looking for is to make sure that it doesn't inadvertently contradict something. So they don't have to ratify it, but they may tell you, actually, you can't do that because it contradicts a provision. Or they may ask some questions about possible consequences of the bylaw that you may want to take into account, which is, again, also why it's really a good idea to send it off to the synod for review before the congregation votes on it. Again, they don't need to ratify it, but they often can provide good advice that you may choose to use, even if you don't have to. And then finally, the least, sort of the most granular, the lowest, and the easiest to amend are continuing resolutions. Once again, these are all local. There are no continuing resolutions in the Model Constitution. It is not required that there be any advance notice given to the congregation council or the voting members of the congregation. And a continuing resolution can be adopted or amended by a majority vote at any legally called congregation meeting, or it's simple majority in the congregation meeting, or even the congregation council alone can amend continuing resolutions by a 2/3 vote. New continuing resolutions, like bylaws, go into effect immediately, and once again, you are required to notify the synod of that. Again, even though synod approval is not required. So as you see, each process gets a little easier to amend each bylaw provision and continuing resolution. As you go down, they in specificity, they become easier to amend.
And you don't have to remember all of this because it is in the Constitution itself.
Yeah.
So if you have any questions about it, look there or contact your Synod office. I'll also point out something about timing of congregation meetings. The first vote can always take place at a specially called congregation meeting that is called specifically for the purpose of amending the Constitution. So if you are not wanting to wait a year to ratify, one possibility is for you to schedule a special congregation meeting, let's say in end of October. You could, it's a little late for that now with notice, but you could call a special congregation meeting and then ratify at the next regularly called meeting, even if the regular meeting is only a matter of months away from the special meeting. So if you are needing to make some changes more rapidly to provisions, that is one option that you have. Let's look now at the actual amendments that were approved by the churchwide assembly this time. And we'll just hit the highlights on these so that we don't keep you too late this evening. Dan, if you'll scroll to C504. This document explains not only what the change is, but also what the rationale was for recommending the change. So C504, the primary change there, we know that in a lot of congregations, it's actually the congregation council that chooses who's going to go to the Synod Assembly. And so the Constitution has always required that it be the congregation meeting that elect, but this has now been altered so that your congregation council can legally elect the persons who will serve as your voting members to the Synod Assembly. Then in Chapter 7, C703, there's nothing untoward there. We just noticed that every other place that the Constitution's referred to what happens if a congregation does vote to disaffiliate, and we had used the word transfer to another Lutheran church body, but transfer is not the word that was needed, and it's certainly not the word that was used in all of the other constitutions. So we just changed the verb to relate to another Lutheran church body. Chapter 9, that was just a case of the sentence was really backwards, and so we just swapped it around. So there's nothing substantive changing there, just the format. Chapter C903, the Churchwide Assembly back in 2019 was revising this list of qualifications and standards for ministers, in this case of Word and Sacrament. And in the process of the assembly debating things, somehow the phrase proclaiming God's love for the world got dropped out. We have gotten letter after letter after letter about that. So God's love for the world has been put back into the Constitution. There was nothing devious there. It was just that in debate and rewording everything, the assembly didn't notice that they had inadvertently left out probably the key thing we're about. Then, Dan, if you'll go to C906, back up to the top of that page. This is a simple word change, but it's an important one. Currently, previously, the Constitution had said that an interim pastor shall be appointed by the bishop. But the reality is that bishops often do not have enough interims to go around, and not every situation is going to call for an interim to be appointed. So we're giving the flexibility now. The assembly has given the flexibility that an interim may be appointed by the bishop, but leaving open the possibility that there are other arrangements that may work better given the circumstances. And then let's see, 915. This is a provision. You'll notice that the asterisk is highlighted. You may or may not already have this provision in your local constitution, but because so many congregations now are finding that looking to some of our full communion partners for pastors to serve their congregations. If you have this in your constitution, then it leaves you available to that possibility. And so we decided to make that, or the assembly decided, I should say, to make that required so that every congregation will have that possibility open to it of inviting a pastor to serve who is in one of our full communion partner churches. Then C1002, all of these others are either things I've addressed or they're just editorial changes. C1002, this is substantive. One of the things we find with congregations is as membership may have shrunk in a congregation, a lot of congregations find in their constitutions that they've set a specific number of voting members to accomplish something. And that can be true of quorum. It can be true of how many have to request a vote or a meeting. But our recommendation now is that you not use numbers of voting members, but rather use percent of voting members as your threshold. That way, if your numbers do decline, you're not in the position suddenly of looking at your constitution and realizing that you can't call a legal congregation meeting because you don't have enough people per your constitution's requirement. So we would suggest that you go through and review and look for those instances and change them to percentages. And the rest of the changes are editorial in nature, and you'll see there really aren't that many of them. And we've had cross-references to the Synod Constitution. It's much easier to cross-reference to the very document that you are looking at the moment. So those cross-references have all been changed. So now that's all that we wanted to explain. And so now we can take questions. I noticed Pastor Beth, you had raised the question of why we would have to go year by year to amend the Constitution and then go to the 2025 model. I'm really only recommending that you go to the 2025 one if you have so many years that you're behind that it's going to be simpler to just compare yours to what is. Let's say it's been since 2011 since you amended. What you will find is that there are certain provisions that may have been amended 3 or 4 times since then by the Churchwide Assembly. And so it may be simpler for you rather than to do year by year by year by year by year, if it's more than 2 or 3 assemblies that you're behind. It may be simpler for you to put the full document next to your full document and just see what's different. And then if be sure to look in the chat because there are several mentions by Synod of who within the Synod is responsible for assisting you with updating your constitutions. And yes, please, please, please always send a revised copy of your constitution to your Synod office because they can then have it. And so if somebody from your congregation leadership calls and says, we're needing to figure this out, they can look directly at your congregation constitution and be able to advise you better about that. What is the ELCA's position on congregations having a board of trustees? That is one of those contextual things that you are able to determine for yourselves. And also some states require a separate board. For example, I know of congregations that the council is recognized by the state as the board of directors of the congregation. In other states, that's not the case, and the council has to elect a separate board of directors within the membership of the council. So those are some things that you would want to consult with your Synod. Each Synod has a Synod attorney who can help you with matters of state law that may affect what goes into your constitution. Then Diane Allison was asking, what percent of voting members do you recommend? That's going to kind of vary depending on what it is that you're talking about. And also the congregation's own tolerance for how many people should be involved in decision making, and how many or how few people could trigger a process. So it's hard for us to recommend. We do recommend that you not set quorum at an unreasonable percentage. Robert's rules would say that quorum is whoever shows up. That may not be comfortable for some congregations, but you certainly would not want to go beyond 50% in setting a quorum or in setting any kind of requirement. And
go ahead.
Go ahead, Dan.
I was just going to say the recommended number for a quorum in the Synod Constitution is 1/3, so 33%. Again, that's just recommended,
Right.
but that is what's recommended for synods, for the Synod Assembly. That might be, again, it gives, and especially that was lowered with COVID just because many people weren't able to make it.
But if your congregation has, let's say, 50 voting members, you don't want to set a bar that is so high, or conversely so low that one or two people can sway everything. But you just want to kind of set it according to who your folks are and what they're comfortable with as far as granting authority. Let's see. Then Pastor Cece, what's the best way to start the process? Compare the new Constitution side by side. Again, that's going to depend on how long it has been since you last amended. And so the simplest, if you've pretty much kept up with the process, the simplest is to just take the amendments document for each churchwide assembly and just make sure that those are incorporated. But if you've gone a while, it's actually going to be a simpler process to compare the full document of the model constitution against your full document, just to make sure you catch everything. Who should be doing that? Again, that's going to depend on your congregation. Some congregations, the full council wants to be involved in it. In other cases, there may be one or two people in the congregation who have kind of that passion for good order and a mind for that kind of detail. And so the council certainly could designate people in the congregation to take on the process.
And as I understand it, anyone in the congregation could go ahead and make their proposals, bring them to the congregation council, and go through the process. You probably don't want to go to that energy, without the support of some people, but anyone can. It's generally more often the case who's willing to rather than who is authorized to, I think. Again, because the actual amendment itself does require several levels of approval.
Then Spencer Berry has asked, for the required provisions, are the amendments to lettered subpoints considered required amendments that must be adopted? So yes, if the provision itself has an asterisk, all of its subpoints are also part of the, if I'm understanding your question correctly, all of those subpoints are part of the required provision. Nancy asked, our council is the board of directors for our church under the state of Texas. Is there a concern with having a member on the council who is under 18? That would be exactly the kind of question to address to your Synod attorney, and your Synod office could send that question along or put you directly in touch, depending on the situation, and let them advise you as to what the state of Texas would allow, because certainly you don't want a vote that that someone could challenge on the basis of the person not being eligible to vote. But if you do have a youth member, when it comes to things like property sales and things like that, you probably would want them to recuse themselves and not vote on that, because it's pretty typical that persons under 18 would not be able to vote on things like that. Bishop Briner commented that they've formed a task force made up of a few Synod council members who will be looking at the Synod Constitution and then farmed out some of the particular provisions to groups who are closest to the work. And so that would be a good approach also within the congregation. Have a group that's directing the work, but then go to, let's say it's about committees, go to the actual committees to have them draft language that would reflect the work that they do, and that would help keep it simpler. Then Karen asked the question to know when the last update was is found written on the copy of the constitutions. Please, 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 when you update your constitution, always put a little footer on it that says amended, January 2026, so that you do know which is the latest version, because it is not uncommon to have congregations looking at 2 or 3 copies of a constitution and trying to figure out which one is the current one. And you would want to archive the previous versions, but you want people only to have current access to the one that is current, so that there's no debate about what provisions are in effect for you at any given moment. Let's see.
There was a question from Diane about a second vote. Does it need a special congregational meeting? I mean, does it need a regular one, or can a special one be called?
The second vote can only be taken at a regularly scheduled congregation meeting that was scheduled because of what your constitution says about when you have to have your annual meeting. So some congregations, my first call congregation had 2 annual meetings, one in January to set the budget, one in January for all matters except budget, and then one that took place in October that was to set the budget for the coming year. So if you have 2 congregational meetings in a year, then either of those could be designated. But it has to be, the second vote always has to be at the regular meeting that was scheduled by your constitution. The first vote can take place at any special called meeting, as long as the business of that meeting is limited to the constitutional amendments that are announced. Bishop Johnson.
Yeah, I wanted to raise a philosophical point that I thought from this summer's churchwide assembly that I think is really helpful, to remind us that Constitution is not the only way to change how a congregation manages its affairs. Bishop Hagmeyer from South Dakota compared, she said, the Constitution is the bones of your congregation. Your policies can be your muscle. And you really want to keep constitutional matters as clean and simple as possible, because they are so difficult to amend and should be. But your policies can do a lot of the lifting work. And one piece that I actually had this in one of the congregations I served, where uh, there was a family that had run a catering business, and they had also been doing some janitorial work for the church, and occasionally they did some of the catering stuff in the church kitchen, which upset some of the council members. And so there was a move to amend our constitution with all these rules about who could use the kitchen and what. And we finally just said, no, this doesn't belong in the Constitution. And really, we shouldn't be making policies about one mistake anyway. But a constitution is a really a heavy lift change to make. Policies are easily amended if you find out something's not working right. So don't feel like you have to address everything by bylaws and amendments and continuing resolutions.
Right.
You've got policies too you can use.
Yes. Yes. And flexibility and nimbleness, agility, those are important things. You want things that are solid, basic principles, but you also want to be able to react quickly as needs arise or as your situation is changing. And so that's where the wisdom comes in as far as what goes into a constitution and what is in the more flexible documents, like policy statements from your council, or even continuing resolutions that spell out policies, but that can easily be changed by the council itself. Well, we have run over by about 10 minutes. Bishop Briner, I'm not sure, and please don't what, but in the chat. Can the congregation, there is one more question from Dwayne Miller. Can a congregation council amend a continuing resolution adopted by the congregation? The answer is yes. And that's where the level of trust with your council is important between council and congregation. But continuing resolutions can be generated either by the congregation meeting or by the congregation council. In some cases, congregation councils are reluctant to change continuing resolutions that were set by the congregation meeting, but that would be an understanding within the life of that congregation and what works and what authority is how authority is shared in the congregation. Should the congregation meeting even make continuing resolutions? There are times that it's appropriate, but again, that's up to the congregation to sort of live into what makes sense in your context as far as setting policies. Some congregations are extremely comfortable with council setting policies in continuing resolutions. Others would prefer that the congregation meeting do that. And that you can only know by living within your own context as to what works for you. Well, on that, we will close. As Bishop Briner mentioned, we'll be posting this on elca.org. If you go to that Constitutions page, we'll post the both the PowerPoint and we'll post the recording of this meeting so that you can go back and review things, or you can share with other members of your congregation or of your council so that they can undertake this process. And we are grateful to you for caring about good order and caring about being connected to the wider church in this way. And we ask God's blessings on your work together.
Thank you, Pastor Fry and Mr. Dan, Mr. Epley. And I just, a special thanks to Pastor Fry, who you might not all know, but is retiring at the end of Deacon Rothmeyer's term. And so we are especially grateful for all the work that you have put into this office. It is has been a labor of love, and we are appreciative.
Well, thank you. It has been a joy.
All
Well,
right, friends,
Go in peace. And serve
serve
the
the
Lord.
Lord.
Thanks be to
Thanks
God.
be to
Thank you.
God.
Amen.
Amen.